Honor, the defense would like to make a motion for judgment of acquittal. The state has failed to produce sufficient evidence to convict Joe Mitchell of the crime charged.
How does the state respond?
The state opposes that motion wholeheartedly.
All right. Can you,
We don't, we feel like we are well on our way to making a case for the conviction of Joe Mitchell.
all right, I find at this time that the state has presented sufficient evidence for the jury to consider in reaching a verdict, and so I'll deny the motion at this time. Does the defense wish to call any witnesses?
Yes, our first witness will be Chris Ravina.
Let's call Chris Ravenna. Witness has been previously sworn. If you'll come up and have a seat in the box, please.
Will you please state your name for the record?
My name is Chris Ravina.
And where do you work?
Work at Ravina's Gun Shop with my brother, and that is located at 2141 Madison Street in Yuba City.
And what do you do at the gun shop?
I work for my brother as a clerk, and I keep the books. My brother, who owns the shop, he does all the gunsmithing work.
And do you know the defendant, Joe Mitchell?
I do.
And how do you know Joe?
Joe's one of the customers at the gun shop, has been for several years. I also know him outside of the gun shop through a semi-professional group that we are both members of called the Scribblers.
And what is that group?
It's a group that's comprised of about 15 men and women who are interested in writing stories. Many of them are also interested in publishing those works, and we meet every month and generally read some of those stories, and Joe's generally there every month as well.
And is this a social club?
I would call it more of a semi-professional organization.
Did you know Leslie Mitchell?
I did not. I knew that she was Joe's wife, but I never met her.
All right, Mr. Ravina, let's go back to the night of September 10th, 2012. Did you see Mr. Mitchell that night?
I did. He came into the store, I guess around 9:30, 9:35 that evening. I was alone at the shop. My brother had gone home for the evening, and he came in, Joe that is, came into the shop to pick up his gun.
Okay. So I guess what happened once he was in the store?
Apparently, Joe had dropped off his gun about a week before for cleaning and repairs. He came into the shop to pick it up, and we talked for a few minutes. I went into the back and found his gun, and then he paid his bill and left.
And was the gun loaded?
It was.
And was this unusual for a gun to be loaded?
No, not really. The bullets, I think, were probably left in the firearm when it was left for repair and cleaning, because we certainly wouldn't put bullets into a gun. And there's nothing really surprising about seeing a loaded firearm.
Right, you were at the gun shop.
Exactly.
What time did Mr. Mitchell leave the store?
I know it was before 10 because that's when we closed up, and he was gone about 15 or 20 minutes before I closed up the shop, so I would say he left somewhere between 9:40 and 9:45 that evening.
And did you watch Mr. Mitchell leave the shop?
I did.
And what was the weather like that night?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
It was raining, dark, there was no moonlight, pretty difficult to see.
But did you see any cars on the street that night?
Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant, misleading the jury.
Where are you going with this question?
I'm simply asking what the weather was like, what he could see. You know that it was raining, but
Well, if we're going into could you see what was outside, I don't think that that's relevant for this witness under the conditions as they existed at that particular location. So I do find that might be confusing to the jury, so we'll just sustain that objection.
I guess just to revise it, so was it raining that night when he left?
It was.
Was it dark that night when he left?
It was.
So you stated, Joe, that you knew Joe outside of being just a customer.
Yes.
And so were you and Joe friends?
I wouldn't say so much friends as social acquaintances. As I said, we were professionally acquainted through the gun shop, where you've been coming for several years, and then also through Scribblers. But outside of those two activities, I didn't know Joe.
And did he tell you anything personal about his his life?
No, again, it really wouldn't have come up in the context of our interactions.
But, you and Joe rode in a car together, I'm sure once or twice.
We did, I believe, once, possibly twice.
But you wouldn't consider you and Joe good friends?
I wouldn't go so far.
And you take an oath here today to swear to tell the truth before this jury?
I did.
And has anything or anyone influenced your testimony here today?
Not at all.
No further questions?
Cross-examination.
Good evening, Mr. Rubin. You work at a gun store, right?
I do,
With your brother?
I do.
And you sell, repair, and clean guns there, correct?
My brother does that work, but the shop does do those.
So you don't do any of the work on the guns?
I do not.
So were you working the night that Leslie Thompson was shot?
If that was the September the 10th, 2012, then yes, it was.
So you knew Joe, correct?
I did.
Socially and as a customer?
Yes,
Okay. And you saw him on the night of Leslie's death?
correct.
He came in, got his gun,
Yes.
stuck around for a little bit,
I'd say about 10 minutes all told.
but he left before you were closed.
Yes,
And you closed at 10.
correct.
So about 15 or 20 minutes before you closed, he left?
I would say yes, that's about right.
So he left at 9:40.
9:40 to 9:45, somewhere in that time frame.
Okay. Now let's talk about your interaction with the defendant that night. He asked if his gun was ready, right?
He did.
And you gave it to him?
I did.
But he left it with your brother about a week ago for some cleaning and repair.
I believe that sounds about right, yes.
And the gun was a .38 revolver, right?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
And when you gave him his gun, he looked at it and broke it, correct?
That's correct.
And you noticed that there were 2 shells in it.
There were 2 bullets in it, yes.
This was strange, right?
Not necessarily. As I said, it's a gun shop. There's a lot of guns and bullets in a gun shop, and as a result, it's not necessarily unusual to see them now. As I said, they more than likely were in the firearm when it was brought in, because it not only would make no sense for us to put the bullets in the firearm, it just wouldn't be safe for us to return it after placing those bullets in there without the customer knowing it was there. So.
But your brother who does the gun cleaning tends to not leave bullets in the gun after he's cleaned them, right?
I don't know that it would be fair to say he never does. I would say it would be fair to say he never puts them in there if they weren't there to begin with.
But the bullets have to be taken out to be cleaned, right?
Correct.
Great. But you didn't remove the bullets that were in there after you handed the gun to the defendant, right?
I didn't. As I said, they were likely in there. They would have had to been in there at the time it was delivered. So.
And Joe didn't remove them either?
He did not while he was in the store.
Okay, so then he put the gun in the jacket pocket, right?
Correct.
Now, have you ever rode in a car with Joe before?
As I said, I think once, possibly twice.
And so you know what he drives, right?
I believe so, yes.
A 2002 white Pontiac.
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And you knew he had a reputation as a fast driver, right?
Objection, irrelevant, whether or not the defendant could drive fast, there's no barrier in this case.
I'm going to overrule as to the substance. I think that the substance of that may be relevant, but I think that you should ask the question, rephrase the question.
Yes, Your Honor.
Away from reputation.
You've seen the defendant drive fast before, right?
I think it's, fast is something that's a difficult, is a difficult thing to gauge. I tend to drive at or below the speed limit myself, so even something a few miles over the speed limit seems fast to me. However, on those occasions, he was driving, faster than I would drive.
Okay. So you saw him drive fast, right?
With that caveat of what fast is, yes.
And so you never knew Joe as a friend and as a business customer to have a temper, right?
Not in my limited interactions with him, no.
Okay. And you never saw him lose his temper in front of you?
Not to my recollection.
And you think you know him pretty well, right?
Well, I think that depends, again, on the circumstances.
I'll say objection, this has been asked and answered and established previously, that he knows the defendant.
So you know him pretty well. So would you say that he was a friend, right?
Again, I think friends going a bit far, I would go so far as to say a social acquaintance, but wouldn't go so far as to say a friend.
Okay. But he also, he pays for your services, right, at Ravenna's Gun Shop?
That's correct.
Okay. And so, again, that night, just to get this, just make sure we're clear here, he left your store at 9:40 that night, right?
9:40, 9:45, yes.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No,
You don't have. May the witness be excused.
yes.
All right, thank you for your testimony today. Let's call your next witness.
The defense would like to call Miss Riley Horn to the stand. Will you please state your name for the record?
Riley Porter,
And Miss Porter, where do you live?
800 Fillmore Avenue in Nita City.
And what do you do?
I run a boarding house.
And how do you know the defendant, Joe Mitchell?
He was a tenant at mine for several years and is currently.
Did you like having Joe as a tenant in your house?
Yeah, he was a good tenant. He always paid his rent on time. He didn't drink. And he was always quiet.
Those are good qualities. Did you ever meet his wife, Leslie?
I did at their wedding, which was a lovely affair.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the morning of September 10th, 2012. Did you see Joe Mitchell that day?
I did that morning around 8:30. He had just received a check for $1,000 for one of his TV scripts, and he was in very pleasant spirits.
Okay, so he was in a good mood that day.
Yes, yes, he was.
All right, so let's fast forward to that evening. What were you doing that night?
I was at home. I was watching TV.
And what time did Joe come home that night?
He came home between 9:40 and 9:55. I heard his car outside the curb in front of my window, in front of my house, and I also heard the sound of his brakes screeching.
So did you see Joe come inside?
I did, yes. My living room and the hallway are right next to each other, and the door between the living room and the hallway was open, and I saw him come through the hallway.
So you stated that you saw Mr. Mitchell come home between 9:40 and 9:55.
Yes.
How can you be so sure that he came home during that time?
I was watching a TV program that I frequently watch, and it has two commercial breaks, one of which is at 9:30 and the other is at 9:55. And the 9:30 commercial break had already passed, and the second one at 9:55 had not yet come, so it was at some point between that window.
Was Joe normally home at 10 o'clock on Saturday?
Always, every Saturday at 10. He listened to a radio program. He was an avid follower of it. It related to mystery writing, which he was very serious about, so he never missed it.
So Joe is sort of a creature of habit when it came to this TV show.
With this, yes, with the show, absolutely, never missed it.
And I'd like to ask again, how were you able to see the defendant come home? Where was your room in relation to Joe's room?
My living room is on the first floor. It's at the foot of the stairs. And his room is at the second floor, at the head of the stairs. And he would have to pass through that hallway next to my living room in order to get to his room.
Okay. Just to clarify for the jury as well, if the defendant came in and out of the boarding house, he would have to pass by your room to get to his room.
Yes, he could not get to his room without passing me.
And that night you saw him when you came in around 9:40, 9:55.
Yes.
Did you see the defendant again that night?
I did at 10:30. He came down to get some aspirin.
And is there also a fire escape connected to Joe's room?
There is.
Okay. And does anyone ever use that fire escape?
Not to my knowledge, that wouldn't be a very wise thing to do. It's not incredibly safe.
Yeah. So you don't encourage your tenants to use that fire escape?
Oh, absolutely not. No.
Do you keep it maintenance? Are there any type of safety checks that you do on that fire escape?
No,
Okay.
I do not.
So, just to be clear, on the night of September 10th, when this murder occurred, you saw Joe Mitchell come home before 10 o'clock,
I did.
and you are sure of this?
Positive.
No further questions? Ross?
Good evening, Ms. Porter. Porter, you were fond of Joe Mitchell, weren't you?
I suppose so. He did what he was supposed to do, and in that way, yes.
And at times, didn't you give him credit, advance credit or loans for his rent?
He was always good for it, so I trusted him.
Okay. So you thought he was an honest, truthful person?
He gave me no reason to think otherwise. Yes, I did think that.
And you personally had never heard anything about his character, right?
Not really, no.
And you didn't know he owned a gun either, right?
No.
And you personally never knew that Joe lost his temper occasionally, right?
No.
But you did know that he and Leslie had separated, correct?
Yes, I did know
And you know that he had blamed Brooke Thompson for that?
that. Yeah, he had mentioned that he thought that she played a significant role in
Okay.
the separation.
So you felt bad for him that night?
That night?
Of Leslie's murder, yes.
I didn't have any particular reason to feel bad for him on that night. I guess just generally I could tell that he was upset.
Okay. So do you feel bad for him in general?
The way that you would feel badly for anyone who lost someone that they
Objection,
loved.
is this question relevant to anything?
Well, I think that how she felt about him, due to bias.
And you feel bad for him today because, I mean, obviously he's on trial today, right?
I would not wish this on anyone.
Because you know what he's going through, right?
I'm sorry,
Objection,
I'm not sure what you
speculation.
mean by the question.
I think that that's a proper objection.
All right. So because you like Joe, right? He's a friend.
I wouldn't say friend, he's a good tenant.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about September 10th in particular. That very morning, didn't Joe Mitchell tell you that he would make Leslie and Brooke feel sorry for what they had done?
Yes.
And didn't he tell you that he was going to go see Leslie that night?
Yeah, he was really excited about his check and he wanted to share that with her.
And so you saw him that night at about 7:15, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so when you saw him at 7:15, was he kind of depressed and stuff, right? Or was he excited?
He was a little sad.
And didn't you find that odd since he was so happy earlier in the day?
People's emotions change throughout the day, so I didn't really notice.
Okay. So now just fast forwarding through the evening, the timeline of the night a little bit. At about 9:40, didn't you hear Joe come home?
Yes,
And you heard his brakes screech, right?
I did.
And it looked like he was in a hurry since he ran upstairs, right?
He did?
And the next time you saw him was at about 10:30 when he came to get some aspirin from you, correct?
Yes.
And you don't think he left during that time, do you?
If he had left, I would have seen him come through the hallway, and I did not see it.
Okay. Now, Ms. Porter, that night, weren't you busy watching TV?
I was watching TV, yes.
So you're watching the screen, you had the volume up, correct?
Enough that I could hear it, yeah.
So your full attention wasn't directed at watching who was coming and going from your house now, was it?
Objection, speculation, the state doesn't know what her attention was like.
I'm sorry, I was making a note in order to restate the question.
Okay. So the volume was up and you were watching the TV, and so your full attention was on the TV rather than who's coming and going from your house, correct?
Is that the question you're objecting to?
Yes.
Well,
I was watching TV and not the hallway, that is correct.
So during that time frame, you can't actually say for sure whether Joe was inside of your house, right?
I suppose not. I saw him come in and I didn't see him come out, but.
Now, Ms. Porter, as you said on direct, there's a fire escape that connects directly to Joe's room that leads outside, right?
Yes.
And through this fire escape, Joe could leave the house without ever passing through the front hallway out the front door, correct?
Yeah, he could.
And you can't hear anyone using the fire escape from your living room, right?
You know, I've never tried it, so I can't answer that question. I don't know if I could hear anybody or not.
Especially with the TV on, right?
I have no idea.
Thank you, Ms. Porter. So you can't actually place the defendant in his room the entire night, can you?
You mean like I wasn't sitting in his room with him and knowing that he was there? No.
And you even heard screeching tires outside of your house between 10 and when the police officers arrived, right?
I did not hear.
You did.
I did?
Did you?
No.
Excuse me. 1 minute, Your Honor.
Yes, I did. I'm sorry, yes, I did hear.
All right, so just so we're clear here, and for the jury and for the court altogether, between 9:40 and 10:30, you heard screeching tires twice outside of your home, right?
Yes.
No further questions.
Read it.
One question on meter.
Ms. Thompson, to your knowledge, no one uses the fire escape connected to your building.
No one uses it, no.
May the witness make sense?
Yes.
And if you can see testimony. Call your next witness.
Yes, the defense calls Joe Mitchell to the stand. Can you please state your name for the record?
My name is Joe Mitchell.
How old are you, Joe?
I'm 28 years old.
Are you married?
I am.
Who are you married to?
I'm married to Leslie Thompson Mitchell.
And where do you live?
I live at 800 Fillmore Avenue in Nita City.
And for how long have you lived in that city?
I've lived in Nita City my entire life.
Does anyone live with you at 800 Fillmore?
Yes, Miss Porter, her son, and some other boarders.
And what is your educational background?
I graduated from high school in Nita City.
Did you attend college?
No, I didn't. I served my country in the Marines in Afghanistan.
And did you receive any further education while in the Marines?
Yes, I took correspondence courses in writing.
All right. And do you work outside the home?
Yes, I'm a freelance writer. I write mysteries, short stories, and TV radio scripts. I don't work for anybody. I'm independent and I work on my own.
And how did you get into that business?
When I was in high school, I worked on the school paper and I've been interested ever since.
And what are some things that you do to help you with that?
I read and listen to The Shadow to get ideas for my writing. I've learned more about mystery writing by listening to The Shadow than any other way. Also, since I write primarily murder mysteries, I familiarize myself with my .38 revolver.
All right. And have you sold any of your scripts?
Yes, I sold one of my scripts on September 9, 2012.
And before you sold that script, what did you do to support yourself financially?
I had some money saved from the Marines, and I also worked a part-time job at a gas station.
All right. Joe, you mentioned that you're married to Leslie Mitchell. Where is she now?
She's dead.
And when did Leslie die?
She died on September 10, 2012. It was the worst day of my life.
All right. And Joe, I'm going to ask you questions regarding your relationship with Leslie Mitchell. When did you first meet Leslie?
I met Leslie Mitchell 4 years ago.
And when did you and Leslie marry?
We married on November 15, 2011. So we got married about 3 years next week.
And where did you and Leslie live?
We lived at 50 Jackson Street.
Did Leslie support your writing?
She did. Leslie was interested in my work as a writer. She thought I had a future in it. It was her idea that I should dedicate all my time to my writing.
And did anyone oppose your marriage at your wedding?
Yes, Brooke Thompson, Leslie's stepmother, did. She didn't even attend our wedding or the reception that followed.
And still you got married?
Yes, we loved each other very much. She was the love of my life, and I couldn't live without her.
You mentioned that Ms. Thompson opposed your relationship with Leslie. Can you briefly tell us when Ms. Thompson began opposing your relationship?
Since the beginning, she never liked me.
And how did Ms. Thompson oppose your relationship?
When I was dating Leslie and coming to her house, Mrs. Thompson repeatedly told me that she didn't like me, that she didn't think I was good enough for her daughter. She said that I was not the man for Leslie, and she would do all she could to prevent us from getting married.
But you got married anyway.
Yes, because we loved each other too much to let her get in the way.
All right. Mr. Mitchell, can you briefly tell us how your relationship with Ms. Thompson was after you married Leslie?
Well, I frequently visited Mrs. Thompson at her home at 1751 Madison Street.
And why did you visit Ms. Thompson?
Well, she was the mother of my wife, so Leslie and I visited often. I wanted all three of us to have a healthy relationship.
And how were your visits after getting married?
Mrs. Thompson continued to tell Leslie and myself her opinion of me, how much she hated me being with her daughter. She called me nasty things, such as lazy and a no good.
And how did Ms. Thompson's opposition affect your relationship with Leslie?
Well, it hurt me. It hurt me very much to know that the mother of the love of my life didn't want me to be with her. Eventually, I stopped visiting Mrs. Thompson. It was a lot to handle.
Did Leslie continue to visit Ms. Thompson?
Yes.
And what happened at these visits?
After Leslie visited Miss Thompson tried to get Leslie to leave me and go back to 1751 Madison Street several times. Every time Leslie said no, but Mrs. Thompson kept trying.
And how did these visits affect your relationship with Leslie?
Well, after a while, Leslie lost interest in my writing. She began to talk about me getting a real job. But I don't get it. She was so interested in my writing before.
And did you and Leslie separate?
Yes, eventually we did. On July of 2012, Leslie said she was leaving me and going back to live with Miss Thompson.
And how did this make you feel?
How do you think I felt? My wife left me, all because Miss Thompson. Because she didn't think I was good enough, but I was. I loved her daughter more than anything in the world.
Mr. Mitchell, after you separated, did you try and get Leslie back?
Yes, after we separated, I go to Miss Thompson several times a week to try to persuade Leslie to come back to me.
And Mr. Mitchell, briefly tell us what you did on September 9th, 2012.
I went to Mrs. Thompson's house and spoke to Leslie and tried to persuade her to come back to me, but it didn't work.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you detailed questions about September 9th, 2012. On that day, what did you do?
Well, I went to Mrs. Thompson's house and spoke to Leslie and tried to persuade her to come back to me, but it didn't work.
Did you speak to Miss Thompson?
No, but Mrs. Thompson insisted on me being there while Leslie and I talked. And again, she always told me in front of Leslie that I was no good and lazy. Mrs. Thompson always stepped in when I tried talking to Leslie.
When you spoke to Leslie, what did you say to her?
I don't remember the exact words I said to Leslie, but the gist of it was I asked Leslie for the last time to come back to me. Still she refused, and then I said, we're all through then. I'm sorry it didn't work out.
Anything else?
I remember saying something about making both Leslie and Mrs. Thompson sorry for what they had done to me.
And what did you mean by these words?
Well, I didn't mean I'd do any physical violence to them. What I meant was that when I made it big with my writing, they would regret leaving me.
And why did you say these things?
I was confused, hurt, and upset. I love my wife, and I wanted us to be together.
And what happened next?
I left. After I left, I drove around the streets for a while, trying to think things out. I was so upset that I wrote a letter to Leslie.
And what did you write her?
Well, I don't recall exactly what I said, but I do remember saying something making them regret what they had done to me. Like before, I didn't mean physical violence. I only meant that Mrs. Thompson will regret what she had done when I made it big with my writing.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, you testified that on September 10th, 2012, you tried to persuade Leslie to go back to you. What motivated you to make that attempt?
On September 9, 2012, I received a check for $1,000 as an advance for a TV script that I wrote. I decided to wait until the next day and then surprise Leslie about it.
Who was the letter from?
It was from Wilson Studios.
And what did you do with that money?
Well, on September 10, 2012, it was Leslie's birthday. I cashed the check and bought her a 5-pound box of candy.
Anything else?
I paid Mrs. Porter some past due rent and board.
And how is this success going to help your relationship with Leslie?
Well, since I had just gotten my first check for my writing, I wanted to share it with her. I thought that my writing success would get us back together. I just wanted to see Leslie to tell her about my good luck, and maybe she would come back to me after all.
Mr. Mitchell, did you receive any other letters from Wilson Studios?
Yes, I also received a retraction letter, but I didn't see it until after I was arrested.
All right. Mr. Mitchell, are you familiar with Night City?
Yes, I am,
And why are you familiar with Night City?
because I've lived here my entire life.
Were you living in Night City on September 10th, 2012?
Yes, I was.
Your Honor, I'd like to mark this as the defendant's exhibit 1.
I think that would be number two.
Oh, this is-
Number two.
I'm sorry, number 2, please. And Your Honor, may the record reflect that I'm showing defendant's exhibit number 2 to counsel? Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Mitchell, I'm showing you a diagram that has been marked as defendant's exhibit number 2. What kind of diagram is this?
This is a diagram of Nita City.
Is this diagram a fair and accurate representation of Night City on September 10th, 2012?
It is.
Thank you. Your Honor, we'd offer defense exhibit number 2 into evidence.
Is there any objection? That'll be exhibit 1 here.
Mr. Mitchell, so you wanted to surprise Leslie on September 10th, 2012. What time did you arrive at 1751 Madison Street?
About 7:30.
Mr. Mitchell, does that diagram show where 1751 Madison Street is located?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Your Honor, may I approach the witness and hand her a pen?
Yes, ma'am.
Using that red pen, yes, please put an X where 1751 Madison Street, and if that's okay with Your Honor.
You're asking for the witness to
Yes,
go up to
get up and,
the visual aid, that's fine.
thank you.
And you can stay there in case he
Okay.
has other things he wants you to mark.
Yeah. As you were walking up to 1751 Madison Street, what did you see directly in front of you?
I saw two porch lights on brackets on both sides of the door. Both lights were on. I knocked on the door and Mrs. Thompson answered. Mrs. Thompson told me that Leslie had gone to the Palace Theater.
And what happened next?
I spoke with Mrs. Thompson.
What did Miss Thompson say to you?
She said Leslie was at the Palace Theater.
And what happened next?
I left Mrs. Thompson's about 7:35 p.m. and drove to the Palace Theater. I thought I would try and surprise Leslie there.
All right, and Mr. Mitchell, does the diagram show where the Palace Theater is located?
Yes, it does.
Using the same pen, please put an X where the Palace Theater is located.
Okay.
Thank you. And at what time did you get to the Palace Theater?
I got to the Palace Theater about 7:45 p.m.
And when you got to the Palace Theater, what did you see?
I saw the ticket seller, Quinn Washington. She was a friend of Leslie's.
And did you talk to Quinn?
I did. We talked for a while. I recall Quinn saying something about Leslie being afraid of me or something like that.
And what did you say in response?
I told her there was nothing wrong between Leslie and I, but that it was all Mrs. Thompson's fault.
And what did you do next?
I bought a ticket and went into the theater. I was going to wait for Leslie. I was thinking about selling my writing that day and how if it hadn't been for Mrs. Thompson, everything would be perfect and Leslie would be sharing the success.
And did you wait for Leslie?
No, I became very upset over everything and I left.
All right. And so what did you do instead?
I decided to drive east about 4 or 5 blocks. I think it was 8:30 p.m. I went to the Silver Dollar Bar.
All right. And does the diagram show where the Silver Dollar Bar is located?
Yes, it does.
And using the same pen, please put an X where Silver Dollar Bar is located.
The court is going to request that, and you can direct the witness on this, it's
Sure.
fine, to initial, the X, if you're going to be
Oh,
sending this back
sure.
to the jury, we
I
want
can do
to
that.
initial the locations next to the X's so that it won't be confusing.
Thank you. And did you drink any alcohol at the Silver Dollar Bar?
I did. I had 4 glasses of beer at the bar.
And how long were you at the bar?
I left the bar around 9:30, so I was there about 45 minutes to an hour.
And where did you go after the bar?
Well, I got into my car. I thought about whether to go back to the theater or to go home. My favorite radio program was due to come on at 10 p.m.
And what did you decide?
I decided to go home. I drove west on Madison. I passed the theater, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look over at the ticket booth as I passed.
Did you drive past 1751 Madison Street?
Yes, I did.
As you drove by 1751 Madison Street, did you notice anything to your right?
I noticed the porch lights and the lights on the lights in the 2 front rooms were on.
Did you stop at 1751 Madison?
No, I continued driving on I continued driving west on Madison.
And then where'd you go?
I went to Chris Ravina's gun shop. It was on my way home, so I decided to pick up my .38 revolver that I had left for cleaning and some repairs about a week ago.
All right, Ms. Richard, does the diagram show where the shop is located?
It does.
And using the same pen, please put Ravina or RG.
You can just put it down.
Gotcha. Thank you. How long were you at the shop?
I was only there for a few minutes. You can check with Chris Ravina about the time.
And what did you do next?
I got in my car, drove back home to 800 Fillmore Avenue. I was never near 1751 Madison Street again that night.
All right. And does the diagram show where 800 Fillmore is located?
Yes.
Using the same pen, please put 800 Fillmore. Thank you. Your Honor, we offer the annotated events exhibit number 2 into evidence.
Any objection?
And,
I think we already put it in evidence anyway.
okay, and can we publish the exhibit to the jury?
Here it is.
All right, can I hand it to him?
Yeah, you
Yeah. Mr. Mitchell, what did you do when you got home?
I went up to my room on the second floor of Mrs. Porter's boarding house. I took off my wet clothes and got into a bathrobe and pajamas.
And what time did you get home?
I'm not sure on the exact time, but I was home in time to listen to The Shadow. I listen to it every Saturday at 10 p.m.
And how did you enter the boarding house?
through the front door.
Are there any other ways to enter the boarding house?
There is a fire escape from the second floor outside my window, but I've never used it, and I always keep my window locked.
And other than listening to The Shadow, did you do anything else?
I was also reading. I had been sitting in a chair reading until the bed was still made up.
All right. Did you ever speak to Miss Porter that night?
I did. I had a headache that wouldn't go away, and around 10:15 or 10:30, I went to Mrs. Porter's to borrow some aspirin. I heard her TV and knocked. She was watching TV in her living room, which is on the first floor facing the street. She gave me some aspirin, and I went back to my room.
And what happened next?
Around 10:45 p.m., I heard a knock on my door. I opened the door to find 2 policemen in uniforms.
Have you seen these officers before?
I've never seen them before.
Did the officers identify themselves?
Yes, one said that he was Officer Pat Sliviak, and he asked me my name.
And did you respond?
Yes, I told him Joe Mitchell, and I said, what was that all about?
And how did these officers respond?
Sliviak said my wife had been shot. That really shook me up. I asked if she was dead.
And what happened next?
Well, I was shaken up and almost fainted. The officer had to help me into a chair. Then I looked down and noticed my wet jacket on the floor and my gun alongside it. I guess it had fallen out of my pocket when I dropped my jacket on the floor.
And what did you do next?
I moved to pick it up to hand it over to Officer Sliviak.
And when you handed the gun to Officer Slaviak, did you say anything to him?
Yes, I said, I have nothing to hide, officer. I handed him the jacket too. I told him again, I have nothing to hide, you take them.
And what happened next?
Officer Sliviak asked me if I would go to headquarters with him.
And did you go to the station with them?
Yes.
Did you feel that you had to go with them?
No, the officers did not force me to go with them. They did not arrest me. They asked me to go to the station and I went with them voluntarily.
And did the officers read you your rights?
No, they didn't say anything to me about having a lawyer, remaining silent, or that anything I had said might be used against me.
All right. And what happened at the station?
I was interviewed by Detective Bradley.
Did Detective Bradley say anything to you?
Yes, he told me my wife was pronounced dead at the hospital.
And then what happened?
I was left alone in the interview room.
Did you stay in the interview room?
I did, but it got stuffy in there, and I decided I needed a little fresh air. I wasn't arrested, and I felt like I could leave at any time. I got up and walked to the front door.
And did you actually walk out the front door?
No, the sergeant at the front desk asked me where I was going.
Did you respond to him?
Yes, I did.
What did you say?
I said to get fresh air.
And then what happened?
At that point, Detective Bradley said I was being arrested for the murder of my wife.
And how did that make you feel?
I was shocked. I just lost my wife, and now I was being arrested for murder. I couldn't believe it.
Did you say anything in response to that?
Yes, I told them I had nothing to do with my wife's murder, and I knew nothing about the shooting. I told them I wasn't near 1751 Madison Street at the time of the shooting. I told them I was at Chris Ravina's gun shop, and then I went right home. I told them to check with Chris Ravina and Mrs. Porter. I said I wasn't near 1751 Madison Street at 10 p.m., and I certainly didn't shoot my wife.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Hi, Joe.
Hey there.
Now, you say you loved your wife, don't you, Mr. Mitchell?
I do, very much so.
And you say that you loved your wife so much that you would have done anything to get her back, isn't that right?
That's true.
And you would do whatever it took to take her back, even if she no longer wanted you, wouldn't you?
I don't know about that.
Okay, but Leslie wasn't coming back to you, no matter how much you begged, was she?
I can't speak to what Leslie was thinking.
Well, she wasn't coming back to you at the moment, was she?
She hadn't come back to me.
Okay, and this hurt you, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And it made you feel a little unwanted, right?
Yes.
And maybe a little bit angry too, didn't it?
I was upset.
Okay, and you directed some of that towards Brooke Thompson, didn't you?
Yes.
You and Brooke didn't have a great relationship, did you?
We didn't.
And you blamed her for breaking up your marriage, right?
She did. She always found time to insert herself into my relationship with my wife.
But you also blamed Leslie for listening to Brooke, didn't you?
I don't know if I blamed her. I was upset that she would let her mother come in between us.
Okay, well, Mr. Mitchell, let's talk a little about your relationship with Leslie. She left you, right?
She did under the advice of her mother.
Okay, and that was because you wouldn't get a real job, right?
I have a real job.
She left you because you wouldn't quit your writing career to get a steady paying job, correct?
Correct.
And even though you begged her over and over again, she was standing strong on that. She wouldn't come back unless you got a steady job, right?
Correct.
But you loved your writing career, didn't you?
Did.
And choosing between writing and getting a job frustrated you, didn't it?
It was frustrating.
Now, you said today that you loved Leslie more than anything in the world, but that isn't exactly correct now, is it?
No, it is true.
Well, you chose your writing career, didn't you?
I continue to write, but I don't know if I chose it over Leslie.
Okay. Well, but it made you irritated that you had to give up writing to get her back, right?
Yes.
And again, it made you angry when she left, didn't it?
I was upset.
Well, to deal with this emotion, you joined Men Angry About Divorce, right?
I did.
Now, speaking of anger, didn't you lose your temper a couple of times at Brooke Thompson's house when Leslie kept turning you down?
I did.
And on September 9th, didn't you make threats directed at Leslie saying that she'd be sorry for what she had done to you?
Yes, but I didn't mean any physical violence.
But just so it's clear on the record, you did say the words, "You'll be sorry for what you've done to me," right?
Yes, I've said that already today.
Okay. And you also threatened Miss Thompson, saying that you would make her pay, isn't that correct?
I did.
And isn't it also true that you wrote a letter to Leslie saying that you would make Leslie and Mrs. Thompson regret what they had done to you?
Again, like I said before, I did not mean any physical harm to them. I just said that because I knew they regret when I made it big in writing that they would
Okay.
be upset.
All right, Mr. Mitchell, well, let's walk through the night of September 10th, step by step. You wanted to see Leslie, right?
Yes.
So on that night, you followed her everywhere she went, isn't that correct?
Objection and proper characterization that the defendant followed Leslie Mitchell everywhere.
This is cross-examination. And I need to admonish counsel that I mean for the opponent to handle the objections since Mr. Cavedo did the direct. In other words, no double teaming. Go ahead.
Well, Ms. Thompson, you followed Leslie everywhere she went that night, right?
No, I didn't.
Okay, well,
I inquired as to where Leslie was
okay.
so I could see my wife on her birthday.
Okay, so you went to her house at 7:30 p.m., but she wasn't there, right?
I went to Brooke Thompson's house and Leslie was not there, no.
Okay, but you talked to Ms. Thompson this time, right?
I did.
And you asked Ms. Thompson for the exact moment when Leslie would be home, right?
No, I just asked when she would be back.
Okay. And Ms. Thompson told you, so then you knew the exact moment when Leslie would be returning home, right?
Yes, Brooke gave a very specific time as to when.
Okay. So after you left Mrs. Thompson's house, you followed Leslie to the theater, right?
I didn't follow Leslie. Leslie was already there.
Okay, you knew she was at the theater, correct?
I did.
Okay. And so you went to the theater to see her, right?
I did.
Okay. And at the theater, you talked to Quinn Washington.
I did.
And Quinn told you that Leslie was afraid of you, didn't she?
She did.
But you were going to see Leslie anyway, so you bought a ticket and went in to see her, right?
I bought a ticket, went inside. I got upset because Quinn told me that my own wife was afraid of me, and I did not pursue seeing Leslie anymore at that moment.
But before you left the theater, didn't you ask Quinn Washington multiple times when Leslie's show would be over?
I don't know about multiple times, but I did ask her, yes.
Okay, so again, you wanted to know exactly when Leslie would be leaving, right?
Yes.
Okay, so after you left the theater, you went to the Silver Dollar Bar,
Right.
and you had a few beers,
Yes.
And those beers sort of helped settle your nerves, didn't they?
I don't know about settle my nerves, but I did drink beers.
Fair enough. So when you left the bar at 9:30, you drove to the gun shop, right?
I did.
Now, you had taken your gun to the gun shop because the revolver's timing was off, right?
That's correct.
So you wanted to make sure that your gun was working perfectly, right?
Yeah, a week prior, yes.
And you thought that 9:30 on a rainy night was an appropriate time to run errands, right?
Yes, because I had money to pay for my gun that I got in the night before.
Okay. Well, Mr. Mitchell, I understand you were in the Marines. As part of your Marine training, you were trained to use firearms, is that correct?
I also completed target practice as well.
Okay, so you would call yourself proficient in their use, correct?
I am.
And in fact, you still own a gun today,
I do.
a .38 caliber pistol, right?
That's correct.
And you still practice frequently too, isn't that correct?
That is true.
And you're a pretty good shot, aren't you? You said you could hit a dime from 100 yards, right?
I've said that.
So then you're sure you could hit a much bigger target at a mere 35 feet, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. So let's go back to the night of the 10th. When you received your gun from the shop, it was loaded, right?
It was.
And you say you went home after that, right?
I did.
And that was slightly after 9:30, around 9:40, right?
Yes, but in between that time, I did take the two bullets out of the chamber, put them in my pocket.
Great, great. But you arrived at your home at around 9:40, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And it's not a very long drive across town now, was it?
I'm not sure how you would describe long, but no, it doesn't.
Well, less than 10 minutes, right?
Sure.
So you arrived home at 9:40, but then you didn't see Miss Porter until you went downstairs at 10:30 to get some aspirin, right?
That's correct.
So between 9:40 and 10:30, you didn't see anyone, did you?
No, I was alone in my room listening to the shadow.
Okay, but so you'll agree that no one could confirm your whereabouts during this period, right?
No. Porter Raleigh knew that I was in the boarding house.
But she didn't see you in this period, right?
She was not looming over me, no.
Okay. Well, Mr. Mitchell, your room at Miss Porter's house opens to a fire escape that leads to an alley outside the boarding house, right?
That's correct.
So you can get outside without walking through the house, right?
That's probable, but that's not what happened.
Okay, but you can get to your car the same way, right? The same way?
Well, I wouldn't know. I've never used the fire escape.
Okay, fair enough. But your car is a white Pontiac, right?
That's correct.
And you like to drive that car fast, don't you, Mr. Mitchell?
I don't know about fast, but I use it to get to point A to point B.
Okay, well, Mr. Mitchell, the next person you saw that night was Officer Sliviak, is that correct?
That's correct.
And he arrived at your apartment about 10:45, right?
He did.
And you told him you were reading, isn't that right?
I was.
But there weren't any books or newspapers out, were there?
I don't remember.
Okay, and the radio wasn't on either now, was it?
I don't remember.
And your bed was still made that night, right?
It was.
Okay. But your clothes from that evening, they were in a pile on the floor, right?
That's correct.
So that's where you put them when you were in a hurry to change, right?
I wasn't in a hurry to change. I had been outside because Brooke Thompson wouldn't let me in the house. When I talked to her, I was running around in the rain all day. So I decided to take my wet clothes off like I think anybody else would do.
Okay, but you didn't put them up, right?
No, I don't know if everybody puts up their clothes when they get home.
Okay, well, your clothes were wet that night, correct?
They were.
So you had been out in the rain that night, right?
Yes.
And also, your gun was lying by your clothes, correct?
It was in my jacket pocket.
But it had fallen out onto the floor, right?
It did.
Okay. And when Officer Sliviak entered your room, it was there lying on the floor, right?
It was.
And that's even though you normally store it in a 5-pound candy box in your closet, right?
I don't know about that.
Just one second, Mr. Mitchell.
Objection, relevance, right?
It goes to the witness's state of mind, the fact that she was in a hurry, didn't have time to place her gun in its customarily stored place.
I'll let you proceed, and if you feel he's going too far, I feel you need an objection.
I can't answer to that. It was not put up, no.
Okay? But you do normally store it in a 5-pound candy box, is that correct?
Sure.
Okay. Now, So you're saying, if I'm understanding, that the gun just fell out of your pocket when you dropped it, the jacket, right?
Yes.
And you couldn't take 30 seconds to put it up, could you?
I'm not sure what, no, I didn't choose to do it that night, no.
Okay. Now, Mr. Mitchell, Officer Sliviak, when he arrived, he retrieved the gun, but didn't you jump up and pick it up first?
I did, I was scared because my gun isn't registered,
Okay,
but
so-
I handed it to him promptly.
But originally, you didn't want him to see the gun, did you?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, but after he saw it, you knew you had to turn it over, correct?
I didn't know I had to turn it over. I felt compelled to give it to the officer.
But you did turn it over, right?
Yes, I did.
And that's because you absolutely 100% knew it would be clean, right?
Yeah, it would be clean because I just paid for it to get cleaned.
Okay. Well, next, Officer Sliviak took you downtown for questioning, right?
Well, I offered to go downtown.
Right, right. But before they were done, you tried to walk out the front door, right?
Yes, it was stuffy in the interrogation room. I wanted to get some air.
And on the way out, they arrested you that night, is that correct?
They did.
All right, Mr. Mitchell, let's talk about some people who are here for you tonight. You're buddies with Chris Ravina, aren't you?
Yes,
And aren't you in a writing group together, the Scribblers?
we are.
And you do business with him too. You pay him to maintain your guns.
Yes,
And you also do business with Raleigh Porter, don't you? You pay to stay at her house.
I do.
But she's your buddy too, right? Because she's left you off the hook for rent before, right?
I don't know if we're buddies. I believe that she knows that when I have the money, I will pay her, and so she trusts that in me.
Okay, well, very good, Mr. Mitchell. We're almost done. So after you talked with Officer Sliviak, you were shocked to hear Leslie was dead, weren't you?
I was.
Is that because you only meant to scare Leslie by shooting at her?
I was not there at, I couldn't have done that because I wasn't there.
Okay, is it because you meant to kill Mrs. Thompson instead?
Like I said before, I wasn't there. I didn't shoot any gun, so.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Need a wrap?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'll see you back at the council table. Thank you. Does the defense have any further proof?
No.
Does the defense rest?
Yes.
Defense rests. All right. Closing arguments. State has the burden of proof in this case, so the state argues first.
Approach the jury.
Well, yeah.
Okay. Joe Mitchell couldn't have it his way, and this made him angry. Joe Mitchell couldn't have it his way, so he threatened an innocent woman and her mother. Joe Mitchell couldn't have it his way, so on the night of September 10th, 2012, he shot and killed Leslie Mitchell in cold blood as she was simply trying to go home. On the night of September 10th, 2012, Joe Mitchell was on a mission to murder his ex-wife Leslie. He had a motive, he had the skill, he had the opportunity, and most importantly, he had a plan. Now, Joe's motive was simple. He was mad at Leslie because she wouldn't let him have it his way, and he wanted to make her pay for that. Leslie wanted Joe to get a job. That's it. But Joe refused, so Leslie left him. Now, Joe has told you over the course of this trial that he loved Leslie and that he would have done anything to be with her. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts show that simply isn't true. Joe valued his writing career more than he valued his wife. He chose pursuing his writing career over pursuing his marriage. But Joe was mad that he ever had to choose. You see, Joe was ashamed, humiliated, he was alone, and over time, this turned to anger. You've seen evidence of this anger. You've heard that Joe made threats directed at Leslie, both orally and in writing. Joe was angry because he couldn't have it his way, and this anger turned to violence on the night of September 10th, 2012. Joe Mitchell also had the skill to pull off the murder. You've heard from Chris Ravina, but also from Joe himself, that Joe was familiar with weapons and he was an excellent shot. Joe could hit a dime from 100 yards away, so you can bet your bottom dollar that he could hit Leslie from 35 feet away. 35 feet is approximately the distance from where you sit today to the far wall over there. It's not a far distance at all. A former Marine who practiced target shooting frequently could absolutely make that shot. Joe could make that shot, and Joe did make that shot. Joe Mitchell also had the opportunity to kill Leslie. He knew exactly what time she would be arriving home because he asked both Brooke and Quinn about Leslie's expected arrival time. Joe also had the tools to commit the murder. He had his white Pontiac to get across town, and he picked up his loaded .38 caliber pistol at 9:30 that very night. This was no coincidence. Joe went to the gun shop late at night in a rainstorm to get the tools that he needed to murder Leslie. The fact that he picked up his gun prior to shooting Leslie shows foresight and a plan. Furthermore, Joe Mitchell had plenty of time to commit the murder. You heard tonight Raleigh Porter testify that she actually saw Joe first at 9:40 p.m., then again at 10:30 p.m. But Miss Porter can't actually place Joe in his room during that time, and in fact, she testified that she heard 2 separate screeching of tires in the alley where Joe parked his car between 9:40 and 10:30. That wasn't a coincidence either. That was Joe Mitchell first leaving and then returning after he murdered Leslie. Joe had 50 minutes to drive roughly 6 miles, and you've heard from testimony that he prided himself on being a fast driver. You've also heard from Officer Sliviak that that trip doesn't take much time at all. Joe had plenty of time to get from the boarding house to Brooke Thompson's house and back within that 50-minute window. Now, members of the jury, you've listened patiently to all the testimony and evidence at trial thus far, but now I would like to walk you through exactly what happened step by step on the night of September 10th. On that night, Joe followed the source of his anger, Leslie Mitchell, to her home and then to the movie theater. At both places, he asked specifically for the exact time when Leslie would be heading home because he wanted to know when he needed to show up at Mrs. Thompson's house later that night. After he left the theater at about 8:30, he went to the bar to drink some beers and calm his nerves. He then left to the bar and went to pick up his gun at 9:30 on a rainy night. A strange time indeed to be running errands without some ulterior motive. After he left the gun shop, Joe drove to Raleigh Porter's boarding house, arriving at approximately 9:40. But Joe didn't stay there long. Soon after 9:40 p.m., Joe snuck out of the house via the fire escape and jumped into his white Pontiac. He sped out of the alley and made the short drive across town to the Thompson home, where he knew Leslie Mitchell would be arriving. As he drove up, he saw Leslie Mitchell walking towards the front door. He slammed his brakes at the curb, took aim with his .38 Special, and shot Leslie in the chest. He immediately then sped off and returned to the boarding house, where he cleaned his gun and waited for the police to arrive. So there you have it. This is how the evidence suggested the crime unfolded. Now, the defense has tried to muddy the waters with several alternative theories, but you should remember tonight that the simplest story is often the correct story. Joe Mitchell had the motive, the skill, the opportunity, and a plan to commit the murder. The facts and evidence support this. Nevertheless, it is important that we address some of the defense's theories. Now, the state has shown you tonight that Joe made violent threats on multiple occasions to Leslie and Brooke. He was angry that he had been discarded, and he was going to do something about that. Now, the defense would have you believe that Joe was harmless and that he never meant the threats. Members of the jury, do not be fooled by this. Joe Mitchell is on trial for murder, and if convicted, he's going away for a long time. This means that you must be leery of anything he says. He has every incentive to mislead you. But members of the jury, the proof is on the paper. I'm going to make both of you regret what you did to me if it's the last thing that I do. How better to strike back at Brooke than to kill her daughter, the daughter who scorned Joe in the first place? Joe made threats, Joe meant those threats, and Joe followed through with those threats. Now, the defense will also likely tell you that the timeline doesn't make a lot of sense. It didn't make sense for Joe to go home before coming back to kill Leslie. But members of the jury, Joe knew exactly when Leslie would be arriving home because he asked about it multiple times. Joe knew where he had to be at 10 o'clock, He knew he had time to kill before it was time to kill Leslie. So he went home, he waited, and then drove across town. The defense will also likely argue tonight that it just didn't make sense that Joe got across town without anybody seeing him, especially Raleigh Porter. But jury members, you should be leery of this for two reasons. First, Raleigh Porter has no credibility. She's Joe's friend, she's Joe's landlord, and she stands to profit from his acquittal. But more importantly, Raleigh did hear Joe leave that night. Remember, jury, Raleigh heard someone coming and going that night. She heard the screeching of tires in the alley twice. That was Joe Mitchell. Joe left by way of the fire escape, so he never had to pass Raleigh's door. So to be clear, Raleigh Porter's testimony is largely worthless for the defense. She can't place Joe in his room at the time of the murder, and in fact her testimony leads to the conclusion that Joe did in fact leave that night. Finally, the defense will likely argue that the conditions made it impossible for Brooke to see the shooter that night. But the defense doesn't have any clue as to whether the conditions made it hard for Leslie to see. Listen, we can postulate, guess about the conditions all we want, but Brooke Thompson was the only person at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. Brooke said she could see the defendant clearly enough to identify him, and she swore to this under an oath in front of you, this court, and God. That's the bottom line here. Brooke could see, Brooke did see, Brooke saw Joe. Now, in a second, the judge is going to release you to deliberate and to return a verdict. Before he leaves, he will read you jury instructions. Those instructions include elements of each crime for which Joe is charged. For first-degree murder, you must find that Joe killed Leslie and he acted deliberately in doing so with intent to kill her. Now, you can also find tonight that Joe was guilty of second-degree murder, which requires that you find Joe killed Leslie and that he intended to kill or cause bodily injury to Leslie or some other person, such as Brooke Thompson. It's clear that on this night, Joe acted deliberately and with intent. He asked questions to establish the perfect timeline. He laid alibis. After all, as a murder mystery writer, he understood the importance of alibis, and he made threats. All of this is clear indication that Joe planned Leslie's murder. But the defense will still argue that we can't prove that Joe actually killed Leslie beyond a reasonable doubt. But here's why the defense is wrong. Jury members, there is one piece of evidence you heard tonight that was stronger than the rest. And this is the evidence that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe Mitchell killed Leslie. That evidence is eyewitness testimony. Brooke Thompson stood on her porch, opening the door for her daughter to come home, when she unmistakably saw Joe Mitchell drive up to the curb, take aim, and gun down Leslie Mitchell. The defense has no answer to this testimony. Now, they can try to discredit Brooke, but Brooke has no reason to lie about her identification of Joe. No, she and Joe weren't best friends. No, Brooke didn't approve of Joe's relationship with Leslie. But there is absolutely no evidence on the record to suggest that Brooke has ever lied to hurt Joe in the past, nor is there any evidence on the record suggesting that Brooke is lying now to hurt Joe. Brooke saw Joe, she saw him clearly, and this proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe killed Leslie. Tonight, the defense had to show that Brooke was a liar, and they have offered no proof of that. They haven't given you any reason to doubt what she says is true. And if Brooke's not a liar, then the case is closed. Her eyewitness testimony proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe killed Leslie. The eyewitness testimony is the strongest evidence, it's the best evidence, and it's the evidence that the defense simply cannot refute. But even if you don't believe Brooke, believe the other eyewitness who saw Joe at the scene that night. Believe Leslie Mitchell. Members of the jury, 2 people saw the crime unfold, and 2 people saw Joe in the car at the scene of the crime. Leslie saw Joe pull up. Leslie saw Joe pull out a gun. And with her last words, her dying breath, Leslie identified her killer that night. Oh no, Joe. Now, the defense will say that Leslie randomly blurted out this name, that she just happened to have Joe on her mind, or that oh no, Joe referred to another Joe. These are silly. These are ridiculous attempts at muddying the waters. Leslie saw Joe Mitchell, and she called his name as he pulled the trigger. Brooke Thompson, a mother, watched her innocent daughter die on the ground in front of her, and there was nothing she could do. But there is something that you can do, the jury. You can ensure that justice is served. You can ensure that a murderer doesn't walk out of these courtroom doors having gotten away with it. And you can ensure that result by returning a verdict of guilty for the crime of murder in the first degree. You've heard the facts tonight, and their implications are clear. Joe Mitchell couldn't have it his way. This made him angry, so he shot and killed Leslie Mitchell, the source of that anger. 2 people saw him do it. Now you must do your job and convict Joe Mitchell for justice and for Leslie. But as you leave to make your decision, I simply implore you to remember Leslie's final words. Oh no, Joe. Thank you.
Your Honor, may I approach the projector before I start? Members of the jury, this is a case about misidentification. It is very difficult to go through life without ever misidentifying someone. I have misidentified someone, and I'm sure that many of you have also. And even if you haven't, you probably know someone that has. And no one should pay for misidentification, and that's why we're here today. Joe Mitchell met Leslie 4 years ago. They started dating. They were the archetypal young couple, like Romeo and Juliet. We heard Joe testify that he loved Leslie, and because of this love, he took her hand in matrimony. Joe Mitchell promised to love his wife for the rest of his life. But like Romeo and Juliet, Family Feud turned this happy ending into a tragic one. That's right. Miss Thompson never approved of Joe. Actually, Miss Thompson hates Joe. And now the prosecution is charging Joe Mitchell for loving his wife too much. You heard the prosecution say, if Joe Mitchell could not have his way, then he was going to shoot Leslie. So the prosecution is charging Joe Mitchell with first and second degree murder. And they have the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that all of the charges are true. First, they must prove that Joe shot Leslie after deliberation and with intent to cause her death. Second, they must prove that Joe shot Leslie with intent of causing her death or serious bodily injury. And you know the prosecution story. They allege that on the night of September 10th, 2012, Joe drove from west going east on Madison Street. They allege that as Joe drove by 1751 Madison Street, he shot and killed Leslie. But no others were on the street. No one to corroborate this story, no one but Miss Thompson. And according to Miss Thompson, this happened in a couple of seconds. 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough to charge Joe Mitchell with the murder of his wife. And so that's how the story goes, or so the prosecution says. But it's not that simple. In trials like this one, the prosecution puts together a bridge that leads you to one conclusion. But at the end of the day, if there are missing pieces of this bridge, or missing links in the chain, then you must acquit Joe Mitchell. Because what happens to a bridge without foundation for those that walk on it? They lose their liberty. Now in this case, the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe is guilty for the crimes that he has been charged with. They have failed to prove that Joe shot Leslie, let alone after deliberation and with intent. So let's talk about this case, shall we? It started off with my co-counsel and giving an opening statement, and since the beginning, our story has been consistent. There has been no missing pieces in our bridge. And the prosecution also came before you and told you a story. They told you that you will hear information about how Joe intentionally shot and killed Leslie. But let's take a look at the evidence in this case, the only evidence that you're allowed to use today. We heard from Ms. Thompson, the only eyewitness in the case. Although it was a dark and rainy night, Ms. Thompson claims that she properly identified Joe. We heard from Ms. Thompson that the shooter was 35 feet away. We heard that all of this happened within a couple of seconds, or 2 seconds. And lastly, we heard from Ms. Thompson that this incident occurred at 10 p.m. But we also heard from Ms. Washington that Joe was at the Palace Theater and left around 8:45. Palace Theater. We heard from Mr. Arena that Joe stopped by his shop and left around 9:45. We also heard from Ms. Porter that Joe was home between 9:40 and 9:55. Then we heard from Officer Sliviak that it takes about 7 to 10 minutes to drive from 1751 Madison Street to Fillmore Avenue. So even if Joe was home at, say, 9:55, he would not have enough time to drive to 1751 Madison Avenue by 10 p.m. to shoot and kill Leslie. Because, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot be at two places at the same time. And if that's not enough, we heard from Officer Sliviak that he doesn't even believe that Joe did it. In addition, we heard that the paraffin and the ballistic tests were inconclusive. So what is the only conclusion that you can make today beyond a reasonable doubt? The only conclusion that you can make beyond a reasonable doubt is that Joe is innocent. But you are the wise judges in this case, not me. You sat here during the trial. You listened to all of the witnesses. You saw the evidence and documents. And now you have to go back to that jury room and make a decision. Well, I suggest to you today that the evidence you have does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe is guilty of the crimes that he's been charged with. If anything, they prove that he is not guilty. But in the great state of Tennessee, Joe does not have the burden of proof. The judge is going to instruct you that when you go back into that jury room, one side has the burden today, and that side is the prosecution. And if the prosecution fails to prove beyond a reasonable doubt any element of the crime, then you must acquit Joe Mitchell. The reason why your job is important today is because someone's liberty is at stake. Outside of this building, there is an engraving that reads, "Equal justice under the law." What this means is that you cannot allow your feelings or emotions to make a decision today. It's easy to think that because Joe and Leslie had a few problems, because Joe said a few things that sounded bad, he is guilty of the crimes that he has been charged with today. But that's not the law in Tennessee, and that is not the law that you are applied in this case. The burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charges are true. This means that every time you walk by this building, you will have the same conviction. Tomorrow, next month, years from now, and for the rest of your life, you will have the same conviction. And as I said before, there is no information that can lead you to the conclusion that Joe is guilty for the crimes that he has been charged with. So please go back into that jury room, communicate with each other, talk about the witnesses, talk about their impossibilities. And I ask you to make the only conclusion that you can make today, and that is that Joe is not guilty. Thank you.
The court will now instruct the jury on the law governing this case. You must arrive at your verdict by unanimous vote, applying the law as you are now instructed to the facts as you find them to be. The state of Nita has charged Joe Mitchell with first-degree murder, which includes the crime of second-degree murder. Defendant has pleaded not guilty. Under the criminal code of Nita, a person commits first-degree murder if, after deliberation and with the intent to cause the death of a person other than himself, he causes the death of that person or another person. Under the criminal code of the state of Nita, a person commits the crime of second-degree murder if he intentionally, but not after deliberation, causes the death of a person, or with intent to cause serious bodily injury to a person other than himself, he causes the death of that person or of another person. A person acts intentionally with respect to a result or to conduct described by a statute defining a crime when his conscious objective is to cause such result or to engage in such conduct. To sustain the charge of first-degree murder, the state must prove the following: that the defendant performed the acts that caused the death of Leslie Thompson Mitchell, a human being, and that defendant acted after deliberation and with the intent to cause the death of Leslie Mitchell or any other person. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that each of these propositions has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. But if you find from your consideration of all the evidence that any of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder. To sustain the charge of second-degree murder, the state must prove the following: that the defendant performed the acts that caused the death of Leslie Thompson Mitchell, a human being, and that the defendant intended to kill or cause serious bodily injury to Leslie Thompson or any other person. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that each of these propositions has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. But if you find from the consideration of all the evidence that any of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant not guilty of second-degree murder. It is your duty to determine the facts and to determine them only from the evidence in this case. You are to apply the law to the facts and in this way decide the case. You must not be governed or influenced by sympathy or prejudice for or against any party in this case. Your verdict must be based on evidence and not on speculation, guess, or conjecture. From time to time, the court has ruled on the admissibility of evidence. You must not concern yourselves with the reasons for these rulings. You should disregard questions and exhibits that were withdrawn or to which objections were sustained. The evidence that you should consider consists only of the witness's testimony and the exhibits the court has received. Any evidence that was received for a limited purpose should not be considered by you for any other purpose. You should consider all the evidence in the light of your own observations and experiences in life. Neither by these instructions nor by any ruling or remark that I have made do I mean to indicate any opinion as to the facts or as to what your verdict should be. The state has the burden of proving the guilt of the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt, and this burden remains on the state throughout the case. The defendant is not required to prove his innocence. Reasonable doubt means a doubt based on reason and common sense that arises from a fair and rational consideration of all the evidence or lack of evidence in the case. It is a doubt that is not vague, speculative, or imaginary, but such a doubt as would cause a reasonable person to hesitate to act in matters of importance to themselves. The defendant is presumed innocent of the charges against him. This presumption remains with him throughout every stage of the trial and during your deliberations on the verdict. The presumption is not overcome until, from all the evidence in the case, you are convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant is guilty. What I'm going to ask you to do when you deliberate is to consider the charge of first-degree murder. If you find that he is guilty, then you come back into the courtroom to deliver that verdict. If you find that he is not guilty of first-degree murder, then you consider the charge of second-degree murder. If you find that he is guilty of second-degree murder, you come back to the court and you deliver that verdict. If you find that the evidence is not sufficient to support either first or second degree murder, then your verdict is not guilty, and that would be the verdict that you would bring back to the courtroom. This is very informal, what I'm doing right now. It doesn't happen in a real courtroom. What I'm going to ask you to do so that you can confer in private or deliberate privately is to just file outside the courtroom here and deliberate and knock on the door when you have reached a verdict.